Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
Yeah. Summer's hot. I know. It's always been hot, and sometimes the temperature gets hotter than normal. That's a heat wave. We've always had heat waves, too. But if we define heat waves as a period when the temperature is hotter than normal, what do you get as the normal temperature gets higher and higher? Spoiler, you get this.
Let's talk more now about what is happening in India, recording its highest ever temperatures, Delhi hitting 52.3 degrees Celsius. The government's Weather Bureau reported severe heatwave conditions, breaking the landmark 50 Celsius mark for the first time.
More than 2,760 pilgrims suffered from heat stroke due to intense heat. Tragically, 14 Jordanian pilgrims lost their lives during the first day of stoning.
Dangerous and potentially record-breaking heat is moving across North America with millions under alerts. The hot and humid conditions expected to last for several days in some parts of the country.
Is a heat wave on its own fatal? Not really. Or at least they haven't typically been fatal to those who can find ways to stay cool, or if the conditions that come along with the heat allow our bodies to sweat enough to cool down. If you can't do either of those things, though, the situation gets critical, fast. Our standards for heat waves are rising. 30 degrees used to be exceptionally hot. What will we do in Canada when 40-degree conditions last for days? What do we, and by we, I mostly mean our governments and institutions, need to understand about the heat waves of the future? I'm Jordan Heath Rawlings. This is The Big Story. Dr. Kent Moore is a professor of atmospheric physics at the University of Toronto. Hello, Kent.
Hello, how are you, Jordan?
I'm doing well because I'm inside right now enjoying some air conditioning, but it is hot in Toronto and in other parts of Canada.
That's what I hear. I'm in Vancouver today, but I hear it's quite hot.
We've been told to expect a heat wave. That is not a new thing, but we're going to get into the specifics of it and break it down a little bit. But maybe first just start, can you define a heat wave for us? Is there a technical threshold for that?
You know, there really isn't. People have various definitions of what a heat wave is. For instance, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, it defines a heat wave as a period of abnormally hot weather.
That's very vague.
Yes, I know. It extends for a few days to a month or so. It is vague because I think heat waves take on different sort of characteristics in different parts of the world. The ideal way to define it would be, we sort of know that, say, in some area, what the average temperature would be, let's say, in June or July. Let's say typically in Toronto, it might be, let's say, 30 degrees, and then about 50% of the time, it could be, let's say, between 25 and 35. And then, when you get above that kind of 35 range, that gets into what we would say would be abnormally warm. But unfortunately, people haven't sort of settled on a technical definition of that sort. The other challenge, of course, is the time period.
Right.
Some heat waves can exist for a few days. The one in BC in 2021 was like almost 6 weeks long. So they do have varying lengths, and that obviously also impacts their severity, right? For a couple of days, it's possible to kind of mitigate some of the effects of the heat. But when it goes on for extended periods of time, it just gets more and more difficult for us to kind of deal with that heat.
Obviously, correct me if I'm wrong, but as the climate warms and the average temperature changes, the temperature to qualify for an abnormal temperature that would be a heat wave would also be going up.
Yeah, that's kind of one of the problems that we have in a lot of areas when we studied the climate, is that generally, climate is about averages, right? And so, the average temperature in Toronto 20 years ago isn't the average temperature today. And so it's true that the definition is kind of moving along. And that actually makes it hard to actually also characterize things because, again, as it gets warmer, the definition of what extreme is becomes larger. And that's a problem because our bodies, they don't care what the average temperature is. They care what the temperature that they're feeling is. And so as it gets warmer, this extreme gets higher, but the impact on our bodies doesn't change, right? So if 35 degrees is a high kind of impact temperature, then at some point in time, we'll get to a period where that may be the average temperature, and that is just really kind of horrible. So it is true that things are moving along, and that makes it difficult to define things because the average is always changing.
Before we get to why some kinds of heat can be more dangerous than others, what is the difference between a heat wave and a heat dome, which I believe was over BC a while ago that you were referring to, and is apparently over a lot of northeastern America and Canada this week?
Extreme heat typically occurs when one has high pressure. So you think about a summer's day when it's totally clear, there's no clouds in the sky. That's generally where you have high pressure. And so when you have high pressure, you tend to have warmer temperatures. And it's partly because of this, what we call adiabatic compression. The air is warming as it descends. Now, in a heat dome, what happens is one has a region of high pressure, which is stationary over a region for a period of time. So again, in that period of time, then one has this constant descending motion. The air is constantly warming. So the heat dome is a heat wave that extends for maybe 3 or 4 or 5 days. So right now over southern Ontario, there's this kind of region of high pressure extending from the south up towards the north. And the heat in there becomes kind of trapped. It just doesn't have anywhere to go. It gets warmer and warmer and warmer. Eventually, that high pressure system will break down. The low pressure system will move in, and it will typically cool down by a bit.
I'm led to understand some heat waves can be way more deadly than others. So how do people typically judge if the weather is hot enough to be dangerous to them? And how does this sometimes miss the mark?
Yeah, so there's a saying, it's not the heat, it's the humidity that gets you, right? And that's the case because one of the ways that our body cools down is that it sweats, right? So essentially, that sweat appears on your skin. That moisture then evaporates. And that process of evaporation actually cools your skin down. Okay, so that's one of the reasons, that's one of the ways that we regulate our temperatures is by sweating. And if you imagine you're at 100% humidity, that means the air is totally saturated. It can't take any more water vapor in. If you sweat in that condition, that sweat can't evaporate because the air is already saturated. Okay, and so in that case, there's no comfort that comes from that evaporation, and you just feel hot, right? And so if the humidity is very, very low, let's say you're like in Arizona, then that kind of heat regulation mechanism is quite efficient. And so you can cool yourself off quite easily. If you've ever been to the Amazon or somewhere right near the tropics where it's very, very humid, you can feel that heat much more because your body can't regulate its temperature by that sweat mechanism. So that's why humidity plays a big role in our perception of what heat is. So there's a bunch of different ways that meteorologists measure humidity in the atmosphere. One way is what's called the wet bulb temperature.
Yeah, can you explain this to us? Because this is a phrase that's been thrown around a lot over the past few weeks with respect to a projected heat wave in Europe and also the current one. And explain it to us maybe with an eye on the kind of heat we may be seeing in the future as the climate warms.
Yeah, so it's a great name, wet bulb temperature. So what does it mean? So what it does is imagine you have a thermometer, okay, and you take a cloth which is saturated with water. You put it over the thermometer, and then you measure the temperature. Assume there's no humidity in the air, so the air is very, very dry. Some of the moisture is going to start evaporating off of that cloth, and it's going to cool the thermometer down. So the wet bulb temperature is always less than what's called the dry bulb temperature, which is just the temperature you have if you didn't have that rag on it. Mm-hmm. And the amount, that temperature difference tells you something about how much water vapor is in the air. Okay. So it's a technical way to measure humidity. I personally don't like it because the wet bulb temperature is always less than the dry bulb temperature. Okay. Because again, that thermometer is being cooled by evaporation. So when it's very humid, the wet bulb temperature is exactly the same as the dry bulb temperature. But when the humidity is not 100%, the wet bulb temperature is less than the dry bulb temperature. And so that might make you think that, oh, if the wet bulb temperature is, let's say, 25 degrees, maybe that's okay. But if the temperature is actually, let's say, 30 degrees, then that's probably not okay because that means that you've cooled it down. So what I prefer is the Humidex, which I think everyone has heard of. And it's actually a Canadian invention.
I just learned that today when I was preparing for this interview that we came up with it.
Pretty cool, eh? We do a lot of things well in Canada. So the Humidex is always higher than the temperature when it's humid out. And so let's say it's 30 degrees outside, okay? If the relative humidity is 50%, that means that the air is holding half of the amount of water that it could theoretically hold. Then the Humidex is about 36 degrees, okay? And that's starting to get in the discomfort range. The temperature is 30 degrees, but your body thinks it's 36 degrees. And that's, I mean, if you ever felt 36 degrees, you know that's getting to be a bit uncomfortable. If the humidity is 70%, then the Humidex is in the low 40s, which means that it's quite discomforting to be in that sort of temperature. And if the humidity is, let's say, 90%, then we're up at 45 degrees, and that is very dangerous.
How does the general climate and the design and architecture of various cities impact this stuff? And I ask this because as we were preparing for the heat wave Southern Ontario and Quebec are getting this week, there is also a predicted heat wave in the UK in which I saw people issuing warnings because temperatures could be around 26 degrees in London. And like obviously to people in Toronto right now, you know, it's well over 30 and feels warmer than that. Why wouldn't we worry about a 26 degree heat wave, but London needs to?
So again, it comes back to this definition of what a heat wave is, right? So it's abnormally high temperature. And that depends on your average temperature, right? And of course, it depends on the infrastructure that you have, right? So, you know, a lot of, let's say a lot of buildings in the UK are built out of stone, right? There's air conditioning is not very common. Mm-hmm. Then again, that higher temperature, even 26 degrees may become stressful because again, if you're in a building which doesn't have great ventilation, you know, the walls are thick and it retains heat, then that can be quite bad for you. You know, I'm on the West Coast this week and air conditioning on the West Coast was not very common until recently. You know, so in that heat wave in 2021, where the temperatures were really quite high in BC, it was a real problem because a lot of people didn't have ways of cooling themselves down by that, say, having air conditioning in their houses. So again, it depends on sort of the infrastructure that you have. And so, you know, in Southern Ontario and along the eastern seaboard, warm summers are not that unusual and humid warm summers are what we usually get. So we've, if you like, helped kind of manage that by, you know, everyone has air conditioning or most people have air conditioning. So it does depend sort of on what the norm is and how you have in the past, you know, managed extreme heat. So I assume that in, you know, as the UK warms up, I assume that air conditioning is becoming more common. But again, I don't think we should belittle heat waves in other parts of the world because again, their norm is not our norm. And so they, even 26 degrees could be quite bad for them.
When you're talking about heat with a high level of humidity, what does and doesn't work beyond air conditioning to cool people off and keep them out of that danger zone?
Yeah, so there's also an effect called the urban heat island effect, which essentially just means that generally in built-up environments, it's warmer. So one of the reasons there is that, you know, we have a lot of concrete. It's relatively dark. When it's dark, it means that it's absorbing a lot of solar radiation. So again, if you've ever, I used to live in a part of Toronto that had a really nice forested area next to a kind of a built-up area. And when I walked my dog along the street in the summer, it'd be really, really hot. As soon as we went into the forested area, the temperature dropped by, let's say, 5 degrees or so, just because you're in a canopy area, right? So, you know, so the trees are absorbing some of that radiation that would normally hit the surface. And so things that we can do, if even something simple like painting the concrete white, I think it's crazy, but white means that it's reflecting some of that radiation back to space. And so if you replace a dark surface, let's say, a parking lot with asphalt, with just white asphalt, that will actually reduce the temperature because, again, some of that heat that would have been absorbed by the asphalt is now being reflected back to space. Same thing happens with roofs. If you put a green roof on a building, it'll kind of cool the city down. Trees are a great way to kind of block some of that sun and also provide shade. So there's a bunch of sort of, if you like, things that we can do to cool our cities down. And I think the only way really to deal with this is to reduce the future effect of climate change. If we don't control our carbon emissions, then we're going to continue to warm the planet up. And, what we think is a normal today will become much more extreme in the future. And that's really the only way to really manage the heat is by just reducing our use of carbon. We have a certain amount of heat we baked into the system now because of the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. We can't do anything about that right now, but we can reduce the future warming that's going to build on the warming we have now. That's under our control if we can reduce our emissions of carbon.
Well, that brings me right to my last question, which is about what we can expect for the future. As you mentioned, there's more warming already baked into the system. When you look at some of the hotter places in Canada during these heat waves, how far are we away from when that warming takes effect? Some summer days, asking parents to keep their kids indoors and it not being the typical heat waves we might remember from our younger days, where it was really hot, you were sweating all the time, you maybe weren't uncomfortable, you might have to sleep in the basement at night, to things that could pose like a health risk at scale.
That's a really good question. And I can't give you a definite number, but I always think of this analogy of if you have a pot of water and, you put a frog in it and you slowly increase the temperature, right? The frog doesn't really know it's getting boiled until the end. And we're kind of in that thing is that the frequency of these extreme heat events has become higher and higher. But it's a slow thing, right? Like it's not like overnight. We're suddenly going to be in a situation where it's like, let's say in Toronto, 40 degrees every day during the summer. But we're slowly getting there. Every year, the temperature goes up a bit, becomes more likely we're going to have an extreme heat wave event more frequently. And so I would say we've got maybe 15 or 20 years before it gets to the point where it becomes really impactful on us. But that runway is pretty short to make major changes. All the signs are there, and we just have to sort of understand that these are going to become more common and it becomes more normal, right? So people aren't that phased now when the temperature gets above 40 degrees because it just happens more and more often. So it's one of these things where it's a slow process and we're slowly boiling ourselves. And at some point in time, it's going to get to the point where we actually have to make these major changes in the way that we live. But the evidence is it's going to happen. And the fact that the last year is the warmest on record, and that warmth seems to be persisting, I think gives us, real cause to think about these things and try to manage our carbon emissions now so that frankly in 20 years, we don't have to keep our kids inside throughout the whole summer, or we don't have to have every, building in Canada needs air conditioning and things. But unfortunately, if you don't do anything, that's what our normal is going to be like.
Kent, thank you so much for this. Thanks especially for explaining how it works so we understand what's going on next time we're sweating a lot.
Okay, it's my pleasure, Jordan.
Kent Moore, professor of atmospheric physics at the University of Toronto. That was The Big Story. For more from us, including plenty of climate doomerism. Can you feel the excitement? Seriously, though, we really like explaining these things because, at least for me, understanding this helps it be less psychically scary and more of a real problem to confront. So, indeed, if you want to learn more about the crisis we find ourselves in, you can head to thebigstorypodcast.ca. You can also send us feedback by emailing hello@thebigstorypodcast.ca or by picking up the phone and leaving a voicemail when you call 416-935-5935. The Big Story is in every podcast player, and it's on the smart speakers when you ask them to play the Big Story podcast. If you like this podcast, the best thing you can do for us is tell a friend or a family member about it. Thanks for listening. I'm Jordan Heath Rawlings. We'll talk tomorrow.